Back in 2020, I made a video on what I thought to be, at the time, the biggest rival for every Overwatch team. We're nearly 3 seasons down since that video happened, and obviously a lot has changed. Different storylines and new history. The last one feels a bit outdated, and the league could be over pretty soon, so time to revise. This is the biggest rival for all 20 franchises, in my opinion. And as we start with the Atlanta Reign, who could possibly be a better fit than the Shock? As early as 2019, these two were duking it out. It oftentimes led to upsets in multiple playoff meetings. In fact, the Shock and Reign met each other in the playoffs for 3 straight years. It started in 2019, with one of the craziest C9s in the history of the game, and then the Shock knocked them down the following year. And in 2020, it was taken to another level. They had multiple close games in the regular season, followed by Atlanta ultimately knocking out the defending champions in the playoffs. Nearly every game of importance in the Reign's history somehow, someway involves the Shock. They faced frustrating defeats in stressful matches that eventually made them better. And up until 2023, if the Reign wanted greatness, it usually went through the Shock. The Boston Uprising. The lack of success throughout the years can make this pretty difficult, but in my opinion, it is the Houston Outlaws still. It feels to me like the Outlaws have pushed Boston through tough defeats while simultaneously bringing out the best in them. Who could possibly forget about that Map 5 banger to decide who would make Stage 1 2018 playoffs? And that eventually would go on to push them above and beyond in Stage 3, and you know what happened there. And even though it wasn't for a great reason, what about the 2020 Toilet Bowl? That's an all-time classic, and now here in 2023, they're rivals once again. Throughout the years, Houston have always been a proving ground of sorts, and that's what makes a rivalry special. Think back to the Toilet Bowl and the 2020 playoffs, and how those were some of the only semblances of joy that Boston fans would feel all year. And how about the scrappiness of 2019 with fusions, or even what's been happening here in the present? For whatever reason, Boston always go all out for the Outlaws. That always feels like the team they want to beat the most every single year. That's their goal. They want to surpass them always. And with that kind of mindset, there really is no better pick. The Chengdu Hunters. Chengdu are rather strange, and I'm not just saying that because they don't exist anymore. It's always felt like no single team has really been their definitive rival. It really depends on the year, just because of their inconsistency and wacky nature. But when you think back to their biggest points of relevance, at least recently, the Shanghai Dragons are a pretty decent shout. The most obvious thing to point out is when they were the one team that always stood in the way of Chengdu's domination in 2021. They played some tense games in that summer Zhoudown tournament and are one of the reasons that Chengdu left the league with no trophies to show for it. And I'd also like to think back to 2019. Chengdu were like the OG DPS team back then, but Shanghai eventually adopted their style and pretty much showed them up on it by winning Stage 3, all the head-to-heads, and becoming the better, more known Pharah team. But on the other side of things, Chengdu often kept Shanghai on their toes with some really close matches and their traditional opening day 3-0s. In a way, Chengdu felt like everybody's rival with how much of a pain in the neck they were to prepare for, but Shanghai slightly stand out above the rest. The Dallas Fuel. Now that they've actually found relevance, it's time to move on from the Battle of Texas. While many of their games have been tense and/or shocking throughout the years, nothing really compares to their rivalry with the Dragons in 2021. 2021 is when the Fuel finally started to figure things out, but in order to realize their greatness, they had to be pushed to their limits by the almighty Dragons. And this was peak Shanghai, mind you, so naturally they ran into them a bunch of times. And throughout all of those important tournament matches, plus a few others later on, they kind of brought out the best in each other. They played multiple insane matches, and they'll go down as instant classics. Shanghai are ultimately the ones that made the Dallas Fuel push their limits and finally win something, while showing that there's also still room for improvement. In my opinion, the Dragons gave the Fuel a taste of how they needed to play and what they needed to upgrade if they wanted to break the curse and their limits. Shanghai played a large part in the Dallas redemption story, and I think that they were kind of just attracted to each other by fate, knowing how the beginning of their history started. The Florida Mayhem. The Mayhem have come a long way since my last video in 2020. Their franchise has improved significantly. They've made more of a name for themselves, and as this elevation has occurred, it's become pretty clear, at least in my eyes, that Florida's biggest rivals are the Outlaws. Stretching all the way back to 2018, these two have waged in some instant classics. There's been countless upsets, or times where it just feels like it's closer than it probably should be. In 2019, Florida beat a red-hot Houston team and had that legendary Zephyr Bastion meme born. In 2020, the heavily favored Mayhem would end up getting knocked out by the Summer Showdown and the NYXL little brother meme. And here in 2023, they've got a close back-and-forth rivalry as two of the powerhouses of the league. No matter the era, no matter the rosters they're fielding, they always play it close. The Guangzhou Charge. I'll get right to the point. I believe that both Zhou teams are each other's biggest rivals. So Spark for the Charge and Charge for the Spark. While both franchises have been moderately successful, there's been some pretty consistent beef between the two. It's pretty fitting as well, right? They're two of the Chinese expansion franchises, and they're both the Zhou teams. And if you look back at the history, 6 of their meetings have gone to a map 5. And while none of those came in a tournament setting, at least I don't think, a lot of games have always been a proving ground and a way to keep the other one sharp. Both teams have a pretty similar amount of success when looking at history, so really this individual battle is a way for both sides to get the last laugh over each other. From Nero Godsby to Choi Shai, the Zhoudown is an all-time classic. The Houston Outlaws. Unlike Dallas, I actually do believe that Houston's biggest rival is their Texas counterparts. Both gameplay and fan-wise, the Dallas matches have always felt a bit more meaningful. The Texas pride makes the Outlaws and their fans want this maybe a bit more than any of the others. But also, from like a historical standpoint, it's probably Houston's most intense opponent. They absolutely hate them, and for good reason too. The Texas pride, along with always getting in each other's way, makes this an ideal rivalry. The history of this battle has been a roller coaster, to say the least. Houston won a good number of the regular season meetings, but Dallas always seemed to win all of the games with true significance. Houston absolutely dominated in the first year, winning every single matchup, but then Dallas ripped off 4 straight, including the first ever Texas LAN and a May Melee tournament. Then in 2021 and 2022, Houston stunned Dallas on opening day to piss off collectively all Dallas fans worldwide. And yet, after all of those other instances, the Fuel would end up beating them in the more important matches every time without fail. Houston were pretty close to Hawaii on more than one occasion in 2021, and guess who embarrassed them both times? Or how about last year's playoffs? It feels like Houston, every time they make it super far, end up losing to Dallas somehow. It's like Dallas are part of Houston's proudest moments and their greatest torments at the same time. And when you combine that with the state pride mentioned earlier, that makes this a pretty ideal rivalry for the Outlaws. The London Spitfire. Historically, I'd say the LA Gladiators have made for a good rival. When I look at somebody that they've had to overcome to reach greater heights, the Gladiators have done a pretty good job with that. A lot of it stems from 2018, and how their former player Fissure continuously got in their way. It was a team they simply could not beat, and it caused a lot of adversity for the Spitfire that year. But then when they finally turned it around in the playoffs that year, it gave them the confidence to go on one of the most miraculous playoff runs in the history of this league. And then, once again, 4 years later, the same thing happened. The Spitfire couldn't beat LA for 4 years. But in the playoffs, another massive upset happened, leading to their second highest finish in a playoff all time. The Spitfire's 2 best years have involved losing to the Gladiators and eventually overcoming them. What the Glads have meant to London is what it's all about. Somebody who makes you go through serious adversity, then becomes the thing you can look back on and say that you triumphed over in your finest hour. LA Gladiators / LA Valiant. It goes without saying that their biggest rivals are, well, each other. The battle for LA is one of the most iconic rivalries in Overwatch League history. The number of tense matches played right in front of the home crowd in that 1 year in inaugural season had a huge cultural impact on this league. Wings out versus shield up shouting matches, the divided crowds, the tense games, the fissure primal on agilities, Soon versus Surefour. And while results-wise, this rivalry ended up being one-sided for quite some time, there's only been one true blowout in their 6-year history. More than half their matches have gone to a map 5, and the Valiant managed to breathe new life into things recently by winning for the first time since June 2018. The battle for LA is perhaps the biggest duel of pride between any two franchises. Those games were always goated, and the energy arguably even better. The NYXL. New York have butted heads with a lot of teams throughout the years, especially in their early history, and one that always seemed to give them trouble is the Philadelphia Fusion, now of course the Seoul Infernal. Philly and New York went back and forth a lot. In 2018, Philly were the ones that kept New York from a perfect stage, and were the ones to stun them out of the playoffs. In 2020, the Fusion showed them that things weren't going to be so easy anymore, and it kind of signaled the end of an era. On the other hand, Philly were the team that New York beat in some of their proudest moments. Their first stage championship, a couple of the reverse sweeps, and probably some of their best wins in all of 2021. And think about a lot of the individual rivalries going on there, with Poco versus Meko, Jonek versus Alarm, rest in peace, as well as Carpe versus Pine. Their history is super rich, and the dynamic between them is absolutely perfect. The San Francisco Shock. Naturally, when you're at the top for as long as they were, you form a lot of different rivals, but one that seems to have tested the sands of time and is always a pain in their butt is the LA Gladiators. There has not been a single year in history where the Shock have not been pushed or been defeated by their California rivals. Glads have always been an annoying pest, and honestly somebody who's forced them to adapt. In 2018, that was the benchmark the Shock had to surpass. In 2019, the Glads met them in the playoffs and somehow found a way to beat them one time. In 2020, same thing, always beating them and forcing the Shock to adapt. And don't forget about the 5 times that they've met in tournament and playoff scenarios. Some of those games are quite memorable, and Shock have actually suffered on both sides. In 2019 and 2022, they had to go through the Glads in the losers bracket to fuel their playoff runs. But in 2022, Glads were a reason why the Shock couldn't get past second place, not to mention that iconic Summer Showdown match with Shu's crazy bap on Havana. They've played in some serious bangers, and it's undeniably one of the longest standing rivalries in this league's history. The Seoul Dynasty. I've talked a lot about specific teams standing in another one's way in this video, and the Dynasty might have suffered the most of anybody out there, in large thanks to their arch rivals, the Shanghai Dragons. Pretty much anytime Seoul felt pain, and or were attempting to escape their misery, it almost always involved Shanghai somehow. For 4 years and counting, mind you, the Dragons have been a nuisance. One of the most heartbreaking reverse sweeps, numerous tournament losses, and even struggles here in the modern day. The Dragons are a pain in their butt. You can name any tournament since 2020, and I'm willing to bet that there's at least a 70% chance that Seoul played Shanghai. It's absurd how often they end up meeting each other. Dynasty fans are going to tell you how annoying it is to seemingly always lose to these guys every single time. All you want to do is beat the Dragons, but they always find a way to break your heart. But the suffering goes hand in hand. It took testing their patience and building up all that raw emotion for the Dynasty to reach their best moments ever. That sheer desire to beat the Dragons is what made their confidence go sky high when it finally happened. It's through the Dragons that they made that surprise 2020 finals, and that they won the kickoff clash. The Dynasty needed to beat them in order to prove their greatness. Anytime there was a path that could lead to it, it went through the Dragons. Seoul Infernal / Philadelphia Fusion. This is going to sound a little quirky and kind of against my own rules, but I don't think the Fusion have a true rival these days. Instead, I'm gonna say that their biggest rival is second place. In other words, every team that has stood in their way of winning anything. That means London for 2018 and 2022 playoffs. That means New York for the Stage 2 finals. That means Dynasty for the 2020 playoffs and the Kickoff Clash finals. The Shock for the Countdown Cup. And of course the Eternal for the Summer Showdown. They're all equally as guilty for this team becoming a cursed franchise. The Fusion have played some amazing games against all of these guys, but I don't think anybody has pushed them harder or has given off the same emotional impact than the giant pileup of shortcomings. It's not my intention to insult Philly fans or take a free shot at them. I kind of just think fans would agree with me there. It's not really about one or even two franchises anymore. It's about the gold medal that never stops tormenting them. All the teams that have stood in their way kind of blended into one at this point. It's sad, but it's kind of reality. The Shanghai Dragons. While I'm tempted to say like Shock or Fuel for championship purposes, I'd like to believe that their true rival is the Seoul Dynasty. While the Dragons won a vast majority of the matches, the Dynasty have always been right on their heels, just waiting for a moment of weakness for the better part of 3 years. We talk about how Dynasty fans would always get stressed, but let's not forget Dragons fans were probably stressed too. They went through those same close games and were nervous about the result. The Dynasty pushed them to pull off one of the greatest reverse sweeps in the game's history. The Dynasty are the ones that pushed them to be their best in 2021, and were the ones that helped them maintain relevance in 2022. And most importantly of all, Tiger Nation kept the Dragons humble. They would always beat them in the most shocking of times to keep them from getting overly confident. The Dragons and Dynasty played some unbelievable matches throughout the years, and it's the best rivalry in the history of APAC, hands down. The Toronto Defiant. When you've been mid your entire existence, you don't exactly build many long-lasting foes. So for pride's sake, let's go with their Canadian counterparts. And honestly, I'd argue it works both ways for the Titans as well. Vancouver had something special going with the Shock back in the day, but that feels like ages ago, and it poorly reflects upon their overall legacy. Defiant are a more fitting choice, as we've seen a lot of map 5s between the two, and they've always managed to be super good ones. From Shockwave versus Kariv to Spectra versus Sugarfree, these battles have always been enjoyable for the Canadian faithful. There's been a lot of misery from both teams throughout the years, so sometimes it's more so about the small stuff, and you might as well glow over your Canadian pride if you don't have anything else, right? It may not mean that much in the grand scheme of it, but when this is all you really have to look back on, you've got to make the most of it. The Vegas/Paris Eternal. I mean, there's really only one answer here, right? It's the Fusion. I know I was just saying that one season isn't enough for Vancouver, but it somehow is for Paris, and I think that's mostly because, outside of 2020, they've never really had a rival. They never had that team that consistently pushed them, that consistently made them relevant, you know? They never had a map 5 buddy. They didn't really have a European counterpart, and they have 2 awful seasons and 2 mediocre seasons, plus the one in 2020. It's all they really have, and this one year saw one of the greatest rivalries of all time. Every time these two played, it was a banger. They played 3 consecutive map 5s, followed by quite arguably the greatest game in history in the Summer Showdown finals, with some of the greatest moments. It gave Eternal fans some of the only hope they'll ever feel. And of course, in between, there were some other great games, like the Countdown Cup and Shadowburn's Revenge in 2019. It's an all-time classic, and Eternal have never really replicated that kind of history with anybody else ever since. These guys pushed each other to their limit, with some of the most emotionally compelling matches in the history of the game. There really is no better answer. And lastly, franchise number 20, the Washington Justice. The Justice, like many other unsuccessful teams, have kind of been forced into a big versus little brother kind of thing. And in their case, the big brother is obviously the Shock. For whatever the reason, the Shock is just that team that they've chosen to push their limits against regardless of the era. 5 map 5s in 4 years is no joke. No matter how much of an underdog they ever are, they are determined to beat the Shock. They nearly knocked them down to the losers bracket in the 2020 playoffs. Sometimes people forget about that. The Shock were literally the favorites to win it all that year. And think about the number of times the Shock had to reverse sweep these guys just to avoid embarrassment. They've come out on the losing end quite a bit, but I'd say that Justice vs. Shock has formed a lot of bangers throughout the years, and while nothing has really come of it, I think the Shock definitely did make the Justice a better, more exciting team, and sometimes that's truly the thing that makes you a rival. The Justice don't have much going for them in their lifetime, but one thing you can always depend on is them playing some bangers against the Shock. And ladies and gentlemen, that's gonna do it. That is, in my opinion, the biggest rival of every Overwatch League team. Let me know your thoughts and what changes you would maybe make down in the comments below. And if you want more Overwatch League discussions just like this, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you're new. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.